How would federal election law reform actually help Washington state today? Well, let's just dive into some of these details on maybe a handful of these policy proposals that are being made at the federal level today when it comes to election law reform. And these reforms at the federal level, let's just see how they might impact Washington state and other states today. Now, before I kind of dive too deep into this very wonkish topic, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons down below if you haven't already done so. It costs you nothing but just a few seconds of your time, and it absolutely does help in a small way bypass some of the inevitable shadow banning efforts by Google or other people on channels just like this where we might annoy the political elitists. Now, let's go back to federal election law reform. There are a series of policy reforms which have been discussed over recent years, and with the incoming Republican majority in both the federal Senate and the House, along with the Trump administration this next year, it seems highly likely that reforms of some type will be implemented. Now, if they stick to their promises, Governor Bob Ferguson here, he's vowed to stand up in the schoolhouse door and stop any reform from coming to Washington state, just like Southern Democrats fought election law reform back in the 1960s. But I'm not sure that that is a winning strategy outside of the leftist enclaves in which he basically typically prowls. Now, this is actually nothing particularly new in America. Federal election reform is actually fairly common, with each generation tending to experience some type of change implemented at the federal level, usually in response to public outcries related to access, transparency, or other problems associated with the existing system at that time, usually it's at the state level. Now, when America approved the new Constitution for a young Republican in 1787, voting for a nation's leaders was actually a brave new change in a world that was filled with monarchies and kings. And while there is actually a lot of state-level drama in the area of voting rights over the last few centuries in America, I'm basically focusing on just the major changes that were implemented at a federal level. And the first big change that actually occurred, which is more in the 1820s, it was when property qualifications began to be eliminated at the federal level of our nation, and the franchise was expanded to all free men generally. And until the Civil War, there were basically a variety of dramas, kind of mini rebellions, policy fights, and state-level problems, including perceived fraud and lack of fairness in elections. And after the Civil War in the 1860s, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, which focus on the abolition of slavery and then defining citizenship, this actually helped set the stage for major federal voting rights reform. Now, as America recovered from the horror of the very bloody Civil War, where over 600,000 Americans died in just about 4 years, the Reconstruction Era, where the Union armies essentially occupied the southern states and freed slaves were both legally allowed to vote and be elected to office, there was actually a general recognition by the Republicans at the time that the Southern Democrats would resist and were attempting to restrict voting rights of freed slaves and Republicans in the southern states. This actually led directly to the passage of the 15th Amendment right here, making it illegal to deny the voting rights to men based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude that happened in 1870. However, the battle over voting rights in the southern Democrat-controlled states had actually continued, and the Colfax Massacre in 1873, which was in Louisiana, which stemmed from basically concerns about vote fraud by the Democrats, and it ultimately led to a massacre of former freed slaves by the Democrats who were in political power at the time. I've actually discussed this at some length in previous videos. This actually ushered in an era of illegal voter suppression of Black Americans and Republicans in the Democrat-controlled southern states, and that lasted for almost a century of abuse and civil rights suppression. Now, the next big change at the federal level really occurred with the 19th Amendment that was ratified in 1920, which formally extended voting rights for women. Now, for those interested in Washington state history, women actually had a right to vote in the territory of Washington from 1883 until statehood in 1889. And then Washington state actually changed our Constitution in 1910 to restore women's right to vote. I've actually been told that my great-great-grandma was part of the suffrage movement in Seattle at the time. but it was a very large, successful, and popular political movement in Washington state back then, and nationally, of course. Now, on June 2nd, 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was actually passed by Congress and signed by Republican President Calvin Coolidge, and essentially this granted the right to vote to Native Americans that were born in the United States. And this essentially eliminated the claim that there were actually different nations in America and that all Americans could finally be vote and not excluded. Of course, Congress also had to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943, which had actually been on the books since 1882. This one actually had prevented Chinese immigrants to America from becoming American citizens, and it automatically gave them the right to vote in 1943 when Congress finally did this. Now, in 1957, Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and this was after World War II, he signed the first Civil Rights Act since 1875. Right here, this is actually a picture of him doing that. And this focused on rolling back the illegal efforts in southern Democrat-run states to deny the right to vote to black residents. Now, this, of course, increased black American voter participation in the South, but only a little, as the Southern Democrats were using just a variety of tactics to impede black Americans from voting at the time. Now, additionally, the 23rd Amendment was ratified in 1961 to give residents of the District of Columbia the right to vote. And, of course, ultimately, the various failures to overcome the Democrat Party's efforts to suppress the Republican vote in the South was overcome by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which, when combined with the 24th Amendment that was ratified in 1964, which prohibited the use of poll taxes federally or even by states to restrict voting access, these things really made a big difference. Now, one issue the Department of Justice had in enforcing the 1965 Voting Rights Act in southern states, they actually battled this for decades, was the tendency of many southern counties to artificially inflate voting rolls in many jurisdictions with lots of voters who either didn't exist, they had died, or they had moved away. Now, these crufty voter lists, for lack of a better term, these could actually then be used for fraudulent efforts to continue to suppress the votes of local people to push back against the politically powerful elite in each of these counties. Now, many successful lawsuits were filed by the Department of Justice over the decades, really, to address this specific issue, some as recently as just 15 years ago. Now, finally, the 1993 motor voter laws that were signed by Bill Clinton, which essentially simplified voter registration processes. This was really in a response to what was perceived as low turnout in the 1980s. And they wanted to use states using driver's license application process and voter registration or any other interaction with kind of government agencies to kind of become a process to allow people, I should say, to register new voters. So there's just plenty of examples like these all over the place of federal intervention in voting laws over the last few centuries to clearly demonstrate that it's not unusual at all, actually, for the federal government to get involved in this issue. And once again, by the way, it appears that the federal government kind of does this basically every 30 years or so. Essentially, it's just once a generation when some aspect of elections just seem to indicate that problems exist in the current system. So let's be frank. There really should be no doubt, unless you're living under a rock or you work for the Democratic Party, that there are serious problems with our election system in this state. Now, obviously, some states are more screwed up than others, but generally, there have been concerns on this subject for well over 24 years now, really ever since the Hanging Chad fiasco. I got a picture of it right here, but in Florida, basically. This was during the 2000 presidential election in the Bush v. Gore competition. And then, of course, 4 years later in Washington's basically third time is the charm voting embarrassment, where King County Elections earned its current nickname, the Fraud Factory, by discovering secret stashes of previously uncounted ballots in the car trunks of election workers, among other places, until they finally got a third count that was favorable to elect Democrat Gregoire to the governorship, rather than Republican Dino Rossi, who had actually won the first two counts. Now, the Democrats spouted claims of election fraud for 4 years after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And nobody, of course, can yet explain many of the weird problems with the 2020 elections that include this missing batch of 10 million mystery voters that really nobody can explain to this day. Now, in an ongoing effort to demonstrate why federal election law reform is needed, states like Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, and Arizona, who just can't figure out election results for many weeks after an election is supposedly over, they've essentially shown the world that the election system is broken. shockingly incompetent, lacking transparency, and then bizarrely very subpar compared to most third world nations. So this recent demonstration has actually motivated the majority party in Washington, D.C., and that's the Republicans, finally to step in once again and fix some of the broken problems that have been exposed by these recent failures. Now, for this reason, I want to discuss the suggested changes that might matter to those of us who live in a place like Washington State. And these changes would impact every state in America, but the states with the biggest outliers of election policy, like Washington, with an all-mail-in voting system, and then, of course, months of an election season, we're clearly going to be impacted the most. So here's just some of the proposed changes. And then obviously, we're not going to know which one of these survive the sausage factory in D.C., but I would expect all of these changes to be proposed, and we'll have to see how many of them are implemented. And let's start with the first one. This is the least controversial. This is actually to make Election Day a federal holiday. Now, I'm unaware of any real partisan opposition to this policy. Both parties right now, at least, appear to support the concept. At one time, there was Democrat opposition because they believed that if they made it easier for people who actually work for a living, made it easier for them to vote, that this might give Republicans an edge. But that opposition looks bad even to them, and I think that's probably one of the proposals. The second one is obvious, and that's end mail-in voting as a dominant method of voting. And this is really not that controversial since many nations around the world have essentially done this already. Now, no country in South America, for example, really allows the practice in any kind of widespread manner. Mexico, France, and Belgium generally ban the practice because of fraud and perceived fraud at the time. Many other countries have never allowed it from the beginning. And nobody should be surprised that the biggest impact of this change to Washington State would be to go back to some kind of an in-person voting system, which hasn't really been utilized widespread since the early 2000s in Washington State. From a practical implementation perspective, this would actually probably require the state to use local elementary schools as the primary voting locations, which kind of dovetails well with the federal holiday idea that I already mentioned. So clearly there are a few categories of legal voters that need to have some solutions for their ability to vote, that things like deployed military veterans and their dependents, severely disabled voters who maybe can't get to the polling locations, and other kind of edge cases. However, these challenges have already been solved with a variety of options in the past, and so these, I think, are essentially fairly easy to solve now. The third policy that's being discussed is to require identification and citizenship verification for voting. Now, again, this is hardly controversial based on most surveys, but it will require some specific challenges with implementation with professional and voluntary monitors at voting locations. They're going to have the ability to basically verify some type of ID. Democrats have argued that minority voters are actually too stupid or incapable of obtaining identification, but this argument appears just increasingly weak and racist the more that they stick to that line of reasoning, but you can expect to hear it again. Now, another policy is going to be the regular, probably every 4 years or something like this re-registration of voters to ensure signatures match as they change over time and that they have some kind of check on current addresses of people. And this is challenging because roughly 1% of the American population moves every month. And this doesn't mean that 12% of the population actually moves every year, because within that is really just a smaller subset of people that move much more frequently. But it does mean that maintaining accurate voter rolls really needs a formal touch point with the voter, at least for frequently of some kind, to ensure that they still are alive, that they exist, and that they live where they claim that they live. Now, the other idea is same-day vote counting. This should not be that radical, but this really just means that, just like most of the industrialized countries in the world, America needs to actually figure out who won elections, in nearly every case, the same night or perhaps maybe early the next morning, rather than maybe other than some super close races that could require a recount. There should be no more stretching out elections for months at a time or weeks before they can figure out what exactly happened. And finally, no electronic voting machines. They want a paper trail that can be easily audited, verified, and just double-checked, and this will probably be part of this reform. Now, this actually has the least amount of impact in Washington State since we already have the theoretical paper trail, even if they don't let us audit it today. But it would basically nip in the bud the omni-ballot scam program that's in court today, the toilet paper ballot option, which was designed by the legislature, and the electronic voting experiments that have occurred. And I'd also expect this to impact the vast majority of the UCAVA voters, which are essentially not military or military dependents, even though that's why that program was set up. So some variations on these programs would probably be part of the federal election reform effort. That's what I'd expect to see. Now, the impact in specific states is going to vary a bit, but in Washington state, there are really two major impacts. So the first is obviously the most visible here, which is this in-person voting program, which will require widespread voter precinct level type manpower and operations that have not been used for decades in our state. Now, fortunately for us, basically most of the rest of the world, they actually still know how to do this. So we can probably copy some of these best practices and implement them here for our first go-around. Now, for the first time in a few decades, we're going to know who actually won elections, even in most close races, and we can accurately assess voter turnout and other data the very same day of those elections. Amazing times. Now, election observers were only going to need to take 1 day off instead of 8 weeks like they have to do now, and county auditors will need to change how they do things today. No more Renton Highlands Post Office holding stashes of ballots. No more ballots rejected by the post office due to incompetence or a failure to deliver. Now, secondly, the kind of official voter roll cleanup requirements here that would be demanded with this type of reform would probably produce the greatest change to the currently very creaky fiasco of zero transparency and basically completely incompetent outsourced garbage efforts like what they do with ERIC that Washington state currently has today. No more 16 ballots mailed to one house, as King 5 accidentally reported this election cycle. No more fake voter registrations at empty fields or gas stations, and no more registrations of non-U.S. citizens, which is done every day in Washington state right now. So no more ballot harvesting, curing, or similar silly drama that we have to experience. And then finally, I think voter registration drives would start to actually matter again, once again. I mean, political party observers would actually need to be more organized and widespread than either major political party really has done in many decades. So get out the vote programs, including buses and efforts to turn out the vote on Election Day, that's going to matter very seriously in a new reform idea like this. It's not unusual for other states, but Washington, this would be new. Candidate and campaign doorbelling and advertising would actually be required right up until Election Day instead of kind of dropping off for a while. And, of course, lest people think that this is going to bring in some type of utopia, trust me, there will still absolutely be problems. But they'd be different than what we're experiencing today. I'll predict actually a sizable reduction in the current kind of crufty voter rolls that Washington state has by maybe 5 to 10%. This would be due in part to no longer registering non-citizens and the disappearance of people who have died, never existed, or moved away long ago. An employee who works in elections at a local auditor's office basically called these phantom voters, and they do exist on the voter rolls today. And this program or this reform would probably clean that up for the most part. Now, I'm sure that Bob Ferguson would probably be tasked by the people who control him and fund him with trying to protect a corrupt system, and he will do his best to fight that game. But just like the Southern Democrats of the 1960 South, this is probably a losing fight no matter what type of Trump derangement syndrome that Ferguson might suffer from right now. I mean, things change, and we appear to be actually facing an inflection point of sorts, at least at a national level, when it comes to voting. It is possible Washington state would become a state where the Department of Justice has to intervene to force our state to actually stop violating Washingtonian civil rights. But the first step is to reform the federal laws right now. And then this is where I believe things are going to basically go, assuming Trump actually follows through and continues to have the support that he appears to have right now. However, of course, like anything else, we just can't outsource our freedom and liberty to someone else and then just assume that they're going to come save us. Nobody is really coming to save us if we're unwilling to save ourselves. Many of you have spent a lot of time doing a lot of work to address voting problems in our state, or you've done the thankless work of actually being an election observer, or perhaps developing other skills like how to cure ballots and harvest them as allowed by our current laws today. Now, some of that might change, but even if it does, that doesn't end the need for us to be engaged in the political and election process where we live today, right now. Times, of course, will change, and they'll demand our vigilance and attention even more than before. We will have to show up if we want to be part of the solution, and we can't help if we don't stay at home, if we basically just stay at home and ignore it, or we try to run away. Because, again, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.